Finding opportunity in a polycrisis, or in this polycrisis. And our panelists are Gillian Tett, Richard Sammy, and Zia Paton. Gillian Tett was recently elected as Provost of King's College, Cambridge University. She is the 45th holder of this prestigious post since the college's foundation in 1441. She also writes a weekly op-ed column for the Financial Times on global finance and business, and is a member of the Financial Times editorial board. Before her role at Cambridge, which she began just last month, she chaired the FT editorial board US, and during the last decade has written 2 weekly columns covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues. She also co-founded FT Moral Money, a thrice weekly newsletter that tracks the ESG revolution in business. I am an avid reader of her columns and thrilled that she can join us today, if only for a short while. So I'll introduce the others later because I'm mindful of Gillian's time. I also want to thank Professor Garrett for getting you to join us. So Gillian, over to you, and after your introduction, we'll open it up for questions before we go over to Richard and Zia. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I've got to be honest and say I wish I was with you in person in the beautiful sunshine. It's cold and chilly and damp and grey here in Cambridge, but it's a delight and honour to be with you. And what I want to do is share a few thoughts about the whole concept of polycrisis, which I hope will frame your debates for later on. I'm afraid I haven't got very long today. Unfortunately, it's a slightly crazy day for us, but I wanted to share a few thoughts. And as you may know, I was actually trained as a cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist. And I have always found the framing of looking at culture very helpful in making sense of what is going on around me. Some people might think that anthropology is just about studying distant, different cultures, and that is all a bit like being Indiana Jones for academics. In other words, it's about looking at supposedly exotic people who are different from us. I should say that, everybody is exotic to somebody else. Western people, English people, anyone else are exotic too. And in reality, modern anthropology is not so much about studying culture in a very, abstract or backward-looking way. It looks at the modern financial world just as much as non-Western cultures. And in particular, what anthropology tries to do is to jump out of your familiar comfort zone and your environment to go and study other people who might have different perspective on the world so that you can not only understand them better, but also look back and understand yourself. And when you have that insider-outsider perspective, you begin to see the things that people take for granted, the hidden assumptions that shape our lives, which are often very, very important in terms of how we think and act. And I mentioned that because I think one way to make sense of the polycrisis is to recognize that the assumptions that many people in the international business and financial community grew up with in the early parts of their career until about 10 to 15 years ago have fundamentally been challenged by recent events, by the so-called polycrisis. And that helps to explain why we find the current situation so terrifying, so confusing, but also it gives you some idea about where we're going for the future. And to explain that, it's worth saying that I was first made aware of these assumptions when I went to the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2007. And it was my first time in this gigantic, almost tribalistic ritual gathering of the business and financial elite. And what struck me at the time most forcefully was that the outlook of Davos man, or the occasional Davos woman, the kind of international business elite, if you like, was predicated on a belief that there were 3 things which were self-evidently good and which will continue to spread across the world. And those 3 things were democracy, globalisation, and free market capitalism. Those were the 3 assumptions which Davos man took for granted. And in some ways, that was not surprising, because in the 2 decades before 2007, and we're talking January 2007, we'd seen the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We'd seen the impression that Western, liberal values, the so-called free market economic thinking, was spreading around the world. And that was dominating the way that world leaders were looking at issues. It wasn't so much the end of history, to quote Francis Fukuyama, but there was a perception that history was going in one direction, towards more and more democracy, more free market capitalism, and more globalization. That was the unstated assumption that everyone was working with, and that it was basically good. Now, that was in January 2007, and I would argue starting in the summer of 2007, we began to see all three of those pillars, democracy, free market capitalism, globalization, come under attack. The first, in many ways, was free market capitalism, when after the financial crisis, you saw Western governments start to intervene in their financial systems to a really once unimaginable degree. And the idea of free market capitalism dominating in the financial system was basically thrown out the window. Pretty ironic for many of the non-Western countries that have been lectured for years about the need to basically privatize everything. But you began to see Western governments meddle, intervene on a dramatic scale in the financial system. Then you saw them intervene and meddle in a dramatic way in the money markets through quantitative easing, when bit by bit, the central banks, over several years, became more and more involved in the mechanisms setting the price of money around the world in Western financial markets. Then, of course, fast forward to the pandemic, and you began to get government intervention on a large scale in the healthcare systems, and then other areas of the economy, the supply chains. Then comes the invasion of Ukraine, and you get sudden government intervention in energy markets. And you get the rise of national security concerns, and suddenly we have drifted into a world in the West where industrial policy has suddenly become wildly fashionable in a way that was unimaginable 15, 20 years ago. As I say, this will seem very ironic for any countries which have been subject to IMF advice in the past, which was all about free market capitalism. At the same time, we've seen globalization go into retreat. If you look at what's actually happened to globalization in practical terms, it's important to start by noticing that globalization doesn't occur in just one axis. There's a very good DHL survey of globalization each year, done by DHL, the postal group, and NYU Stern. And that breaks globalization into 4 different components. You can have the free movement of capital, free movement of people, free movement of money, and free movement of goods. And if you break those down, what you can see from the charts is that the free movement of money really fell off a cliff after 2007, 2008, the financial crisis. That's partly because of the European Union banking system fragmenting. It subsequently recovered, but it hasn't boomed in the way it was booming before 2007. If you look at the free movement of goods, what you see is that after 2007, for several years, it kept, if not exploding upwards, rising steadily, but it's since been in, if not retreat, then slowing down. And in the 2 decades before 2007, you saw quite dramatic increase in trade in the free movement of goods as a result of the rise of global value chains, supply chains. What you're seeing now, of course, is an explosion in the amount of tariffs and protectionism and all kinds of frictions. And yes, global trade is growing, but it's often growing in an increasingly complex way because of these frictions. And you can't take globalization of trade for granted anymore. If you look at the movement of people, well, that slowed dramatically during COVID. We've now got, tragically, a lot of refugees, record levels of refugees. So people are moving in technical terms. But again, you're seeing all kinds of visa regimes, controls on people, a lot of anti-immigration in the West, suddenly rising really quite sharply. The one area which has continued to see sharp growth has been the movement of ideas. That's down to the internet having essentially acted as a tool of globalization to spread ideas around the world. But even in that area, you're seeing the rise of what people call the splinternet, a growing amount of measures introduced by governments in places like China to create the Chinese firewall around the internet, to talk about creating different internet protocols to control that free movement of ideas. So you add that all together, and what the DHL survey would suggest is that yes, globalization continues to grow slightly. It's still increasing. It's not falling off a cliff anymore. But we cannot take globalization for granted anymore. We live in a world of rising protectionism, fragmentation, geopolitical tension, and essentially a world where localization rather than globalization is often the phrase of the day, or what some people call slowbalization, not globalization, but slowbalization. That's a phrase which was tossed around in the latest IMF World Bank report, which tried to model what would happen if the world was to divide into two trading blocks, a new Cold War, based on what they used as the people who voted against the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the United Nations, and the group that voted, or rather simply abstained from it, or basically indicated their support for Russia. Very roughly speaking, that's the West, and if you like, the Russian-Chinese axis, with a number of developing countries. And if you model that split between the West and, if you like, the anti-Western alliance, and try and work out what would happen if that split turns into a real trading split, a repeat of the Cold War, what the IMF found was that essentially you end up potentially losing 7% of global GDP from trade slowing down, from globalization fragmenting. And no one's saying that's actually going to happen yet. In practice, what's actually happening is that supply chains are still functioning, but they're routed through different regions. So people are still buying goods from China, but often going via Vietnam or Mexico. But you're seeing basically a system that is fragmenting globalization. You're also seeing, this is my key point, you're seeing a cognitive shift as people begin to recognize the risks around that, prepare for it, and think about the dangers and imagine it. As I say, the assumptions that were driving Davos Man in 2007 are increasingly being undermined. And then you come to the other pillar, if you like, of Davos Man in 2007, which is democracy. And it was also taken for granted after the collapse of the Berlin Wall that democracy would just keep spreading and spreading and spreading around the world. In practice, if you look at an index compiled by Bertelsmann of the number of countries around the world which are democratic as opposed to autocratic, what you saw last year was, for the first time since 2004, there are more autocracies than democracies. It's gone backwards quite sharply. And that's partly because some previously democratic countries have gone autocratic. It's also because some countries which were democratic have become seemingly less democratic, or the institutions of democracy have been increasingly challenged. America, where I've spent the last 15 years, is just one example where potentially next year they will have a president who has denied the results of the last election, has indicated his determination to gut the civil service, and where many of the democratic norms have essentially been challenged. And no, America is not at the moment an autocracy, it's still democratic, but on the Bertelsmann scale, it's become less democratic. And you're seeing that being echoed right across the Western world today. So you add those three things together, and you have essentially a world that is very, very uncomfortable for Davos Man or Davos woman, because so many of the unstated assumptions they had in the last 15 years have been badly undermined, if not challenged. And it's a truism of anthropology that we all tend to assume that the world that we grew up with is normal and natural and inevitable. We all assume that's right and proper. And the fact that so much has changed around us is very, very alarming and very unnerving, even before you start to consider what exactly has changed. And on top of that, you also have a world which is facing not so much symbolic or existential crises, but very tangible, practical, real-world problems right now, whether that is the rising tide of climate change, and we have COP28 starting in a couple of days' time, really extremely depressing signals coming out of COP28. It looks as if the goal of keeping 1.5 alive has been lost. We'll be very lucky to keep it at 2 degrees of warming compared to the pre-industrial age. That has very, very big implications for not just areas like the Caribbean, which are at the brunt of weather-related impacts right now, but for millions and millions of people around the world, and of course for many businesses. I don't think that the financial markets are fully priced in yet, the implications of that. In addition to that, you have high and rising debt burdens in many non-Western countries and Western countries too. You have interest rates which are high, and I'm in the camp of thinking that they will stay high for a lot longer than people expect. And you add that all together and toss in, as I said, globalization in retreat, increasing fracture, increasing risks of geopolitical tension, i.e. war, and it's a very, very nasty cocktail. So what can anyone do about it? And I know that the conference has been billed opportunities in polycrisis, not reasons to despair and feel too depressed or pessimistic. So let me say 2 or 3 important things. The reason I mentioned anthropology at the beginning is to stress once again that we're all hardwired as humans to assume that the world we grew up with was natural and normal, and that if it changes, that is somehow a disaster. The reality is that the world we grew up with from 1989 to 2007, in many ways, was very, very unusual. The idea that history goes in one direction, that we are destined to always become more democratic, globalized, and more capitalist, is a very, very odd world compared to most of human history, most of the time. Most of human history, most of the time, did not assume that it was sensible to plan for 100 years and expect that to play out. I mean, the idea of having the confidence to price a bond, a 100-year bond, with a sense of security that you could actually create a model and forecast all the future cash flows would have seemed utterly alien to most people most of the time in history. The idea that essentially most financial traders and institutions and people thought that free money, 0 interest rates policies was normal and it would stay that way forever, that was a very, very bizarre idea for most people most of the time. The idea that actually we could and should all be becoming more globalized and essentially permanently peaceful, and that it was entirely normal to trade with everyone all the time, again, that was not a normal idea in most of history. So I think the first point is to recognize that what has happened in the last 2 or 3 decades in some ways was an aberration. And what we're seeing today is where most of humanity has been most of the time, i.e. consumed with uncertainty and fear and a sense of unease always about conflict breaking out. The second point to make is that one silver lining about the crisis today is that it at least has slapped us in the face about our complacency. And it's made people in the West keenly aware of what values they want to actually champion and fight for. In America, I don't think people have been that aware about what the importance of democracy for a very, very long time. People, young people in the West are increasingly aware of the issues around climate change. Many of them are increasingly aware around the issues of how they actually want to live their lives. So this crisis at least is crystallizing minds about what really matters. The third point to make is that not all of these directions and changes are bad. I mean, one of the things to say about the fact that free market capitalism is in retreat is that it's forcing governments and investors and regulators to think about the relationship between business and society much more clearly. And the idea that somehow markets are these perfect weighing machines that we can just sit back and let the free market take control of everything, and that we should basically insulate financial industry from wider public processes is ridiculous. So the good news is that that is now changing. Increasingly, the relationship between business and society is being remade. Milton Friedman is being challenged by the rise of stakeholderism, by the rise of all kinds of new social trends, which are forcing businesses to wake up and take notice of what's happening around them, whether it's the environment, whether it's around issues of social cohesion or anything else. And in some ways, what's happening is that businesses are learning to take a more anthropological view, if you like, of the world. They're starting to recognize they're part of a social and cultural context. They can't just ignore what context they're existing in, they have to respect it. Or you can simply say businesses are being moved from a world of tunnel vision to lateral vision, where they have to look more widely at what's happening around them, and investors too. But either way, the contract between business and society is being remade. The contract between government and society is being remade, and government and business. I mean, the fact we're seeing the return of industrial policy coming back into vogue is not entirely a bad thing. The reality is that many countries need more industrial policy, not less, to try and address some of the problems and the overreach of markets. Similarly, the fact that you're seeing localization, not globalization, emerging as a theme, again, is not necessarily a bad thing in all of its forms. The reality is that the rise of global supply chains hurt many workers very badly. It contributed to income inequality inside many Western countries. Whole swathes of people were just tossed aside. The workers in the non-Western countries, which were sucked into global value chains, were often treated pretty badly. It was not an unmitigated good thing at all. The fact that you had basically this, goods being transported around the world, whizzing around the world at top speed, again, was not always a good thing, because that contributed to carbon emissions, to all kinds of practices in business which were not particularly respectful of either community or environment. And a new focus on local communities, localism, on resilience, self-reliance, going hand in hand with more industrial policy. Yes, in some ways it's bad, but in other ways it's actually quite positive. Then we get onto the issue of democracy. Well, as I say, I find very little to be cheerful about in relation to the rise of autocracies. But the one thing I would say, as before, is that if nothing else, what's happened in the last few years is making people newly aware of the values that they want to actually uphold and celebrate and fight for, as opposed to the ones they do not. And when I look at things in relation to, say, what's happening with the Ukraine war, so much of that is ugly, so much of that is heartbreaking. And yet, out of the Ukraine war has come a new sense of purpose and unity in Europe, and a new recognition that actually there are liberal values which are worth fighting for in Europe. So I guess what I've been trying to say is that it's very easy to toss around the word polycrisis. It's very difficult. I would never for a millisecond underestimate the scale of challenges we face. But it's important to recognize that aside from the tangible scale of challenges we face to do with high debt, high interest rates, climate change, slowing economy, and perhaps most scarily of all, geopolitical tensions, there's also the kind of cognitive shift of the era that dominated in recent decades coming to an end, which is scary. There's always been opportunity in a crisis. I know that's a theme of your conference. I'm convinced there are opportunities going forward. But a world of localization, not globalization, a world where society and business is forced to redefine its relationship, a world where governments and regulators are encouraged to think in the round, does have its benefits too. So I just wish you the very best of luck in finding the benefits of this big shift, navigating the very, very real risks and challenges, and recognizing that nothing is permanent, and sometimes it pays to look at our assumptions as much as our actual stated and obvious concerns. So thank you very much indeed. I hope that helps, and very best of luck in charting a course in your sunnier climes.
Thank you very much. Do you have time for one or two questions?
Absolutely, yes.
But I have one, and we are in the Caribbean, small island states primarily, and a lot of us have been connected to Europe historically. In the shift, in this geopolitical shift, the shift from globalization to localization, from a governance perspective, should we be aligning ourselves with our historical partners, or what should we be mindful of?
Well, I think it's a very difficult situation.
Yep.
You know, there's a wonderful parable or the quote about, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And I think for many smaller countries right now, there is a sense that we are drifting towards a new form of Cold War, and the people in between are facing a very difficult job trying to stay friends with everyone. At the other end of the spectrum, I was talking to friends of mine in Singapore who are feeling the same thing between China and the US, and they've done a very good job of trying to play or trying to steer a neutral path. I mean, I would argue that clearly, given the geographic location of the Caribbean, and given the history, and given the predisposition of the value set in the Caribbean, that absolutely staying close to the Western world is very important. However, the West is no longer the only game in town. It's no longer a unipolar world at all. And, smaller countries like the Caribbean, if they are clever, can essentially use this multipolar world to their advantage, potentially. Because the reality is that, you've often been treated pretty badly by the West. On the areas of like climate change, areas like, debt restructuring and things like that, you've often been, either patronized or pushed aside or ignored. And having a range of people who might be interested in you, is to your benefit and advantage. So I think at the moment, the question for any countries like the Caribbean is to basically work out what are the values that you care about? How can you build your own resilience? How can you impress on the West and elsewhere about your own needs, the fact you matter, and to try and make your voice heard? What, say, someone like Mia Mottley has done is very striking, because we've not had that level of, if you like, engagement from a non-Western country with so much force on the world stage and forcing at least a conversation about structural reform for a long time. So whether or not you applaud what Mia Mottley's done, whether or not you agree with it, and I know that not everyone does, that shows a model that places like the Caribbean can use to their advantage on all kinds of areas.
Thank you. Anybody else has any questions?
If I may, Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead, Kamala.
Thank you, Gillian. I mean, I was just scribbling furiously while you were talking, trying to keep on top of these many, many wonderful ideas you have shared. But what has kind of sunk in for me is the fact that as much as you have said, the last 2 decades were in many ways a more prosperous world for many. There are those persons who would not have benefited from globalization. As you said, the speed of the supply chain did in fact destroy a lot of persons and communities and so. And something that I found was extremely profound was the fact that a lot of this was sort of taken for granted, that this is what it is and that it was good, when in fact those who maybe had the smaller voices would not have been able to articulate that the policies that they would have preferred would have worked better for them. But being controlled by IMF policies to the most part, which is trying to dictate what more this Western position was, now we have an opportunity to revisit all of that. And I'm wondering if this may not be what is the biggest opportunity for us in this polycrisis, that everything is being fundamentally questioned again.
Absolutely. I mean, On the most basic level, the fact that China now is the biggest lender to low-income countries is forcing people in Washington to rethink their own role and their attitude towards, towards loan programs and sovereign debt restructurings. Now, let me stress very clearly, I am not for a millisecond trying to suggest that China is a better alternative for a low-income country than the Bretton Woods institutions. Not at all. Much of Chinese lending has been very exploitative, secretive, non-transparent. And one of the tragedies right now is that you've got a lot of sovereign debt restructurings held up by the fact that you have not got clarity about the overall debt burden. However, what I would say, though, is that the very fact that, no longer are the Bretton Woods institutions the only game in town, there are alternatives, means that even if tragically low-income countries can't actually access them to their advantage, there is now conversation and debate about ways to actually develop economies and ways to conduct, this kind of, debt relationship. And at the moment, thus far, it's basically been still pretty exploitative for many low-income countries. However, if you go to Washington today and you look at the discussion about industrial policies, if you look at how the relationship between business and society is being remade, if you look at, say, Bidenomics, so much of that is challenging the Washington orthodoxy of 2 decades ago. So it's a very interesting moment. And I do think a world of more localization, a more multipolar world, a world where once taboo concepts like industrial policy are coming back into vogue, a world where people have learned that actually you can have too much deregulation of the financial system. That world is changing the conversation. I'm not for a millisecond pretending it's necessarily making it easier to be a middle-income or low-income country at all. It's also a world where US rates still dominate and, dollarization is a real thing. And that's very brutal for many countries. But we're at a moment of flux. And, I champion anyone who's managed to find their way through this.
Okay,
Thank
so
you. Go ahead,
I'm going
Tamara.
to unfortunately go in a moment. I'm so sorry, but I hope that's contributed in a useful way for your conversations. And I hope that it will help spark more debate later on. And I just say, very best of luck, because, you are in a position to try and chart a new world. And I also hope that your voice on the climate change debate gets properly heard, particularly in the upcoming COP28, because, you have a lot to contribute and a lot to report back on in terms of the practical implications of this.
Thank you. That was excellent, and you gave us a lot of food for thought.
Thank you.
Good luck with the new challenge.
Exactly. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, so I leave Nigel to now introduce your other.
Now you see why I'm such a fan.
I see. I was going to read her too.
Brilliant. Anyhow, so Richard and Zia, I know you are equally as brilliant. Richard is Group Vice President, Republic Financial Holdings Limited, and Vice President of Republic Bank Limited. He has a BSc Honors in Management Studies from the University of the West Indies, an MBA from the Warwick Business School, and is a graduate of the Wharton School's Advanced Management Program. He's a career banker with 20 years regional experience and a former chairman of the Guyana Association of Bankers. Zia Paton is a PwC partner based in Trinidad and Tobago. She's the digital services leader for PwC's Caribbean practice and joint leader of consulting for the Southern Caribbean. With over 25 years of experience, Zia plays a lead role in delivering advisory services across the region. She's currently working with multinational teams on a number of transformation initiatives, including ESG and digital projects. She's a fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, holds an MBA from the Edinburgh Business School, Heriot-Watt University, and is ProSci certified. So I will, after that opening performance, I am asking Richard to help us. What are the opportunities you see from a banking perspective? coming out of this, all this change that is taking place. And I think Gillian put it brilliantly. So much is in flux. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you to the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute for having me. And of course, Republic Bank is always very, very pleased to support the conversation in this space, because we do see it as one of the leading factors that we have to take into account in how we do what we do. I agree with you. I think Gillian set a perfect context. And what I appreciated about her version of the polycrisis and sort of taking that anthropological journey and taking us through it to current is that she focused on a lot of the key risks. I mean, when we look at the World Economic Forum and the Global Risk Report, you know, the risks that are rising to the surface are the risks of the trade wars, of the geopolitical confrontation, the social unrest, increase in inflation, cost of living. And if we think about, you know, bringing that from the global stage to the Caribbean region, I would say we have some that we face very directly and some that we face indirectly. So the direct one, of course, that we're facing, direct ones that we're facing would be definitely the inflation, food and energy inflation. We are seeing costs of living increases. We are seeing very directly climate change, biodiversity loss issues. Indirectly, we're seeing it, the impact in terms of supply chain to the region, because we're heavily dependent as a region on imports, you know, 70–80% of imports in the region. And what does this mean in the context? In the context of the region, I think we need to be very laser focused on our risks against that global setting. So for instance, natural disasters in the region is another huge risk. Gillian mentioned about the region being open to the risk of natural disasters, climate change. I mean, the IMF has actually estimated that it would cost $100 billion in climate adaptation investment to secure our future. When you think about that and you put that in some numbers perspective, that's about 1/3 of the annual output of the entire region. So it gives you that Herculean pull of some of the larger macro issues that we're facing. I mean, if we also consider the top 10 risks that are being faced today, and we project 10–15 years into the future, will those top 10 risks still be here? What we're seeing rising to the future is, and the World Economic Forum actually did a paper on this, 10 years from now, the top 10 risks will be more along the lines of resource constraints, climate change, biodiversity loss, cybersecurity, and we're seeing some of that close to home, social issues, health issues. So if you think about where we are and where we're heading and how we are in the region, we do have a huge role to play. And I love Gillian's second point about the opportunity of the awareness also not just being noise, but making us more able to focus on what really matters to us. Yesterday, I tuned in to Professor Bob Garrett's and also to Victoria Hurd's session. And Nigel, to sort of transition into your question, Victoria used the term the hyper-financialization of governance being a hindrance to the well-being of society and the well-being of how we live. And that hyper-financialization sort of speaks to how public and private sector measured success. And of course, everything was tied to financial metrics, financial deliverables. And we all know the old shareholder value mantra, which had been the core of business. I mean, Gillian also mentioned, which I like and which I subscribe to, the rise of stakeholderism. And so that old or dated, I should say, belief has to be challenged and has to change. We are subscribing to purpose-driven organizations. We are subscribing to greater innovation. We are subscribing to transformation. And we are subscribing to that stakeholder-led lens. At financial institutions, I mean, I could tell you at Republic Bank and in the group, we not only just talk the talk, we've sort of built that into our strategy, into the medium and to the long term. It has to be governance-led. It has to be people-led. And so the marriage of those two is really where we can see some of the change coming from. But in general, business models now in the world, in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly in the financial industry, they have to be underpinned by sustainability in order for us to really withstand the polycrisis that we're facing, both globally, regionally, and then in our local context. I'm not sure, Nigel, if you want me to go into some of the actual avenues that we're taking to explore it, or whether we want to circle back to that.
Yeah, we can come back to that. Let's give Zia an opportunity to get into the conversation, because this is a very, very serious conversation. The implications are mind-blowing. For me, the other hard part, and maybe Zia can help us here, is making it happen. That the whole change management and the whole work. So Zia.
So I'd say the polycrisis, and one large element of the polycrisis, of course, is technological disruption, right? But what technology also provides is an enabler. And it's allowing us to collaborate better, to capture better data, to make better decisions, and to allow for greater technologies in terms of climate tech, etc. So one of the things I wanted to start with is, and Gillian would be happy to maybe email her and let her know, is that at COP28, PwC has actually been working with the Climate Smart, Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerators group. And on December 1st and on December 6th as well, the CEO will be presenting. So what we're working with them to do is to define a climate smart zone, the very first climate smart zone in the Caribbean and Latin America. It covers 26 different territories. Over the past year, we've been gathering significant data across all of these territories and understanding exactly where territories are in terms of their climate action. And Richard, you started talking about some of these statistics in terms of where they are with adaptation and mitigation measures. So once we gather the accurate data, and then we understand, well, what measures and policies are in place now to enable greater resilience. Capture the data and then develop a roadmap that involves all stakeholders. It involves public sector at the policy setting level. It involves private sector investment and private sector funding of the initiatives to really build what is a climate resilient and climate smart zone. It will be the first in the world once that roadmap is developed. So I think it's really important for us to not just be a voice in terms of the impact of the polycrisis to us, but be, exactly as Richard said, an active part of that solution, an active part of how are we gathering the data, how are we presenting solutions. So started off with that practical example of what's going to get presented at COP28, and it's quite a pivotal time. I mean, it's taken a lot of conversation at COP, but the conversation is now starting to pivot into how are we tangibly moving funds to make a bigger impact on the climate reduction that we need. So it's great that the conversations are moving, maybe not as fast as the climate change. So we know we need to pick up the pace. And that maybe brings me to the other part of what we're doing is we're doing significant work with leaders. So we've launched over the last 3 to 5 years a program called the Transformative Leader, because what you recognize is that leaders cannot operate in silos anymore. A leader who just knows banking, you just heard, Richard, a banker, talk about all these different elements that are impacting his operations. Where's he funding? And similarly, you want leaders in their respective organizations to have a much wider lens of the impact that their business is having on the bigger ecosystem. And even more than that is how are they working with that wider ecosystem? How are they partnering and how are they looking beyond their own financial metrics to a longer term view of sustainability? Again, reinforcing, I think the messages that Richard shared, that the lens of being an active part of gathering the data and being an active part of the solutions that we need to address the polycrisis, organizations need to be a part of that. And leaders really need to be very well informed of all of these disruptors and the impact their business is having, and really focus on that side of leaders that is not driven by financial metrics, but what is longer term sustainable metrics, and making the right decisions. They're at that governance table. People who are put at that table are making the right decisions for the longer term benefits. So those are two elements I'd touch on for now. Nigel, maybe the third that I think is absolutely important is, and both Gillian and Richard spoke to it, is the entire reinvention of the business model. The entire reinvention of how do we think about hierarchical structures? How do we think about how we make decisions and what the impact of those decisions are? And how do we involve our workforce in more meaningful ways in that decision making and the impact on them, the impact on our communities? So rethinking, and that's another part of what PwC is an active part of, is business model reinvention. So I'll pause on those three.
Sounds good. So let me ask a hard question. Richard, we are bankers, right? We use other people's money. This is not our money. We have depositors, the depositors. We are good custodians of people's money, and we lend out that money, and we want to get that money back. And we have heard about, the move from free market capitalism to more stakeholderism, to having respect for the communities that we serve, and hopefully our customers as bankers have the same respect for those communities. Having said all of that, we have to ensure that those borrowers are profitable. Because if they're not, they won't be able to pay us back. And we won't be able to satisfy our depositors. How do we navigate this whole stakeholderism thing? And how do we ensure that the businesses we serve continue to create value and are able to capture enough of that value to meet their obligations?
Sure, Nigel. It's not a hard question, but it's an exciting question. That's how I look at it, right? So I'm looking at it as a poly opportunity, not a poly crisis. Right? And you're absolutely right. And traditionally, the bank and banks have a duty of care, and that trust factor has to be the underlying factor in the relationship between banks and customers and other stakeholders as well. And so there has to be preservation of capital. There has to be the tenets of a decent or profitable return on funds. And those are the core sort of 101 banking rules that we live and breathe by. If you switch to the topic and you layer value on top of that, the idea of belief comes into play. And so, for instance, at RFHL, we believe that value can be derived by how we carry out what we do. And so again, coming back to that purpose-driven organization, and in our declaration of purpose, we actually use terms like serving with heart, being deeply committed to your success, and caring. And we actually use that in decision-making, in policy setting, in strategic setting, and we find a way to build that into how we measure our success and measure the impact that we have as well. And our belief is that by engaging in these value-creating activities, and I'll share some with you, and those activities are directly facing the world that we're living in terms of needing to transform digitally, needing to be innovative, needing to ensure that we execute with excellence, being able to navigate the global climate change and the ESG crises that are all facing us. We believe that the steps that we take in those areas will bring that value added that will be built on top of that trust. So for instance, the group has committed to living and breathing those values. We, in 2020, we were the first and only, and I think we're still the only Caribbean financial institution to sign on to the UN's Principles for Responsible Banking. And we've actually already had 2 self-assessments, which have been publicly reported. And that brings me to another point of the accountability having to be built into these new structures that we put in place. We are publicly reporting. We're also the founding signatory of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And we've set our first target, which is to actually reduce our emissions from our real estate by 26.4% by 2030. And even setting that target, Nigel, was no easy feat, because we had to get a global third-party consultant, I think from Switzerland or Sweden, to actually come in and do a full assessment, because one of the challenges we have in the region, of course, is reliable, timely, measurable data. And so it's quite costly, but it's a commitment that we are very, very happy to make. We've commissioned third-party ESG and benchmarking scans, internal carbon assessment scans for the bank itself. And we've actually set up 2 funds, which we view as sustainable funds. One is a US $200 million climate fund, and the other is a $100 million US sustainable agriculture fund. Again, to fund projects in the region. On the climate change fund, we've utilized around maybe 18-20% of it. On the agricultural side, not so much. And we're offering it to governments and partners as well to be able to utilize that fund as a way of building and growing sustainability. We've also set up a Center for Business Innovation, and we specifically looking at SMEs and seeing how we can better lend to them. We've actually just funded 50 million TT dollars just in the local context to SMEs, and we've waived and relaxed a lot of the criteria. So we're not just addressing the climate side of it. We're not just addressing the biodiversity and emission side of it. We're addressing the social side of it, and we really have to adopt a leave no one behind approach when we are talking about sustainability in the region. I mean, the only other thing I'd mention is that this approach has to be fully integrated. It cannot be a parallel stream when you're talking strategy. It has to find itself into your policies, into your offerings. Our next step ahead of us right now is really trying to see how we ensure that all of our suppliers, our partners, even our clients also find a way to adopt some of these policies, and for us to reward them very tangibly in financing terms to adopting some of these measures. And it has to be at all levels, at the corporate level, at the individual level, at the SME level, as I mentioned, at the branch level, and across the region. We also have another program which we're very proud of, and that's our Power to Make a Difference program. Started about 20 years ago with about 400 million TT dollars invested to date, with another 125 million TT to be invested for the next 5 years. We just launched the 5-year plan this week. And we have 4 pillars: the power to learn, the power to succeed, the power to help, and the power to care. And all of these pillars cover everything from education, culture, business, the environment, sport, poverty, the socially marginalized, health, and the differently abled. And we've done our best to align this Power to Care program, Power to Make a Difference program, with the Sustainable Development Goals, so that there is a tie to that national plan, there is a tie to that global plan, both from the environmental and also from the social side. And we've actually restructured how we govern in order to ensure that all of these strategies really become holistic. So we're deeply committed to driving this agenda.
Sounds like an example for a lot of us to follow. Zia, let's go back before I open up for the audience. Just one question. Transformational leadership. How successful has this been?
I would say it has been tremendously successful in that it's a program that we've run across the globe. We've had clients in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, be a part of the program. It's actually a program that we invest in, and persons are exposed to it at no cost. It's leaders at various levels in organizations, different types of industries, different backgrounds, different jurisdictions, territories. They're exposed to leaders across the PwC network that have a lens on various topics about governance, topics about ESG, topics about the financial markets, topics about social and other issues. So it's a program that really helps leaders to appreciate that there is, in this polycrisis, there is a need for transformational leadership. But there is also a need for what we'd call, say, a steady state leadership. Because not everyone is sort of transformational. Not everyone thinks in, Richard clearly is, in terms of taking on board all of those actions that the business needs to do to really transform. But organizations need both types of leaders, because there still is a business as usual to some extent, right? There still is command and support that needs to happen, and the business moving together. So it's appreciating that as you rethink leadership really can take different forms and all add significant value. So there is a need for recognizing what is transformative leadership and who are best sort of suited to bringing that to the organization and implementing it, and those who are a different type of leader but equally important. The other point I wanted to share, Nigel, that's sort of goes beyond the leadership, just briefly, is to share along the lines of what Richard shared, where funding is now. Is that in our latest global investor survey, and for some time now, for at least three years, investors are actually requiring, just like Richard and Republic Bank requesting it, is that where you're putting your funds, you want to understand what policies do they have in place to address governance, what policies do they have in place to address sustainability, and more recently, we're seeing what policies are in place to address AI and risks associated with AI. So investors are setting a tone as to where funding is going to create a more sustainable world, as well as we also note that in our in one of our latest surveys as well, in terms of global trust, that businesses stand at the highest point in terms of where trust lies, right? Right now, businesses are the most trusted organization, more than government, and therefore using that platform, businesses are now held to a greater account in terms of what they're doing for wider society. No longer what are you doing to generate your own profit, but what is the impact you're having? So it was just to share that lens as well.
Thank you.
I don't know if I could
go ahead, Richard.
I think Zia made an excellent point, and it kind of ties back into the question you initially asked. The investors are seeing value in this approach. As a matter of fact, when we looked at some of these stats, I think years ago when ESG was first put on the table, there were about 60-something investment companies with about $6.5 trillion globally. Now, when we look at these stats, there are about 3,800 companies with managing an investment portfolio of about 125 trillion globally. So it's been a quantum leap. And if I were to further that argument, we are seeing where, especially in North America and in Europe, you're seeing where investors are rewarding companies for their moves in this direction, and that is translating into actually improvements in the share price of the companies. If you want to tie that back to the shareholder value point, of course there are criticisms on either side, and people are saying, well, the ESG it may be a bubble, and when you take into account some of the challenges in ESG in traditional portfolios, you may get a lower return on the portfolio. But for the most part, we have found, and again, this is something else we have done, we have layered ESG-led criteria into some of our investment funds as well. We have found that the return has been generally on par, in some cases higher. So you are seeing the belief of that approach in a tangible financial way being rewarded.
Great. Questions. Please feel free to ask your questions. Kamala, are we open? I know you have a question.
But sure, for persons who may have questions as well, please feel free. You can either put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll make sure that the moderator sees it. But something that's just been going through my mind, Gillian left us with a really big challenge. She said there's an opportunity for the region if we can focus on our values in terms of how we can define what do we want, so we can negotiate basically our space on the world stage. And she gave the example of Mia Motley in terms of how she has been able to stand, on a global stage and very challengingly place the position for Barbados. And of course, it made me think, so we in the region have had several iterations of how we get together to try and achieve things, not always with greater success. But Zia, one of the things you mentioned that I thought I would like to understand how it worked, and whether that may be a model for how we could work together. So I just don't know if you can share where you said that there's been a lot of data capture, or I think you said that using AI, but that PwC has been working with the Caribbean Accelerator Group, is it? So exactly who are the Caribbean Accelerator? Are these persons from different countries around the region? Is it an NGO? And how is, so tell us, how did that work, and is that reflective of the kind of value system and working together that can help us to together be able to make a difference on the world stage?
Yeah,
because you really have great expectations for COP28 with them.
Absolutely. So when I think about the catalyst for Caribbean climate smart accelerators, it was a brainchild actually of Richard Branson, because he lives in the BVI, and therefore he experienced firsthand the devastating effects of climate change when BVI was devastated by the hurricanes 5 years ago. And recognizing that there needed to be action to create greater resilience. Statistics show that the Caribbean contributes roughly 1% to carbon emissions, yet we experience close to 40% of the costs of climate impact, global costs. So I think that's no mystery that we do have greatest impact here. But what are we doing about it? So Richard, as I mentioned, was a brainchild, and a number of parties were invited to create what is an NGO. It's not for profit, but it's bringing the skills and bringing the funding and the attention towards solutions. So they defined their strategy, they set up a board, and then defined exactly what they want to accomplish. And one of the key accomplishments is, how do we build a roadmap towards our own resilience? How do we define what we need and then get what we need at the global stage? So very briefly, that was the journey of where we are in this project. Of course, they're doing many other things. We would have supported the organization at its onset in terms of defining its strategy and its plan, and now very specifically supporting them on this initiative. So Kamala, I think when we recognize that we have a problem and we really decide what is the solution and to be a part of the solution and move past the talking about the problem, right? So I think that's ultimately where that project was born out of.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds really interesting. It's something we definitely would want to hear more about in terms of, you know, who are some of the other persons and how are they able to work together? And most importantly, we'd love to hear what is the argument that they will be presenting at COP28, you know, and how that is received. So excellent. Yeah. And I saw that Avia put in the chat a link to Caribbean Accelerator. So thank you very much for that, Avia.
Questions? Don't be shy.
I didn't want to dominate, so I'm just wanting to make sure that persons know we are open to questions from the audience at this time. If there's anyone, feel free to make sure that you let us know that you have a question. So I'm not seeing anything else in the chat just yet, Nigel.
Mm-hmm.
But so all right, so I can continue, right? Richard, if I may come to you then. Republic Bank is a long-standing institution, and therefore change can't be easy. So you would have shared with us that several of your programs are not recent. You know, you've had the power to make a difference for 20 years and some of the things that you would have done. But you would have noted from the conversation yesterday, the challenge all of us are having in moving that needle from evaluation of your organization on the basis of financial performance into how do we truly measure. And I want to go to not sustainability because that's so broad and easy to say, but really let's say, how do you measure purpose of the organization and its impact? And I want to ask if these may be part of the criteria, because I see that there's a substantial amount of money that Republic Bank has set aside for the climate fund, for instance, and the agriculture fund. So how do you go about assessing that, and what was that change like for Republic Bank itself to be able to move from that very tempting metric of are you financially stable and are you profitable into what is the purpose are we going after here, and are you likely to meet that purpose?
Sure, Kamala, thank you. And it's a great question. And it comes down to leadership and the responsibility that we feel we have, not just to ourselves, but the societies and economies within which we operate. We started shifting the needle from only financial to other metrics quite some time ago, and we still have plans to shift it even further. So in addition to the standard financial metrics, we started placing quite some time ago emphasis on employee engagement throughout the group, which is measured by a third-party survey, which tracks questions which speak to the employee wellness, work-life balance, the work situation. So that's one that we focus on. We want to actually push that even further to get a deeper measurement of culture and shifting the culture to one of innovation, execution, and really being ready, in a state of readiness for the digital transformation that Zia also mentioned that we're all going through as well. Another one which is hugely important to us is customer service. And here, again, we use third-party independent experts for customer service, but we are also changing our customer service model to be much more targeted, much more personalized in terms of who we want to reach in order to supplement our existing base as well. Another one that we mention is that we measure is the quality of our operations and the quality of our footprint. And the newer ones that we're adding to the list, of course, is KPIs around ESG, around diversity, equity, inclusion, around stakeholder management, and all of those are sort of sub-measures that roll up into the larger group. And again, what gets measured gets done, as we always say, and we find that to be true. But we also have to challenge the existing measures and ensure that we use sophisticated data in order to be real with ourselves and be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say, okay, this is where we need room for improvement. No organization is perfect. As a matter of fact, we had a culture survey done for the first time a year or two ago, and where we felt we were, way above the rest, we had to be taken down a couple of notches, which we loved because it let us know where we needed to focus on in order to keep constantly improving. So all of those non-financial measures are actually at the board level, and that's translated to the executive level, to the management level, and to the staff across the group. So there is alignment in what is important to us.
So Richard, the question I would follow up with is, do you see a conflict between the financial and the non-financial?
There is an inherent conflict, but we prefer to think of it as a healthy tension, right? So and we look at it like that because we have to be unafraid as leaders to chart this course. When fear starts forming part of how we make decisions, we make less than rich and less than perfect decisions. So there is a conflict. We acknowledge it. We acknowledge, and we've had several debates, very healthy debates around the table on this one. It's healthy in the sense that what we believe, and it comes back to that purpose that I keep talking about, what we believe is that it complements instead of detracts. And so we're viewing this as a full sort of offering in terms of how we measure ourselves, how we want others to measure us, and to be accountable to our stakeholders. Back to that sort of rise of stakeholderism, which I'm gonna steal that term and use it as often as possible.
No, but from where I sit, and I spent 4 years with your competitor JMMB, and we had what we call the vision of love. If you have engaged employees, if you have customers that are, in sync, it's going to get the results that you guys have been showing us. And the point is that I think we have to move away from the conflict to the complement. It may be short-term conflict, but it's long-term, makes business sense.
Definitely.
Gia, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it was specifically to comment on the short-term versus long-term, right? And within businesses and democracy, you have terms, right? And your targets that are set, that are 1-year targets, that are 5-year targets. And that is not helping the globe right now. That's not helping us with the polycrisis. And how we address measurements and targets and reward for longer term gain and actions that are taken today by a CEO or heads in an organization towards a longer term gain and investing in that is really what will start moving the decisions in time. So we do need to take a longer term view. And I'd share that one of the big takeaways, I was part of a leadership development program, and we met about 150 partners, met in Dubai just about 3 weeks ago, or maybe 4 weeks now, or no, 3. And what was really, of course, Dubai is a flagship for transformation and leadership. And it really helped you to step back and think about leadership models and think about what has been accomplished with that longer term view.
I want to go back to the point you made earlier about the climate resilience smart zone. You refer to 26 territories. How does one get involved with this climate resilience smart zone if people want to contribute? Can we contribute?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So the stage that the project is getting to now is that we are having determined and collected the data on where countries are at and what is needed to build climate resilience. We're at the stage of defining what is needed, where those gaps are. That requires investment, that requires collaboration between private stakeholders and public stakeholders. So once that is, as we start framing that, once we start framing what is needed, we absolutely need stakeholders to be on board. So, and organizations, Climate Smart CCSA, so Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, can't do this alone. They're the ones who are simply developing, and we're supporting develop the roadmap. To make the roadmap happen, absolutely need everyone and need support from everyone. So Nigel, there will be an opportunity for further engagement and for more tangible input by different stakeholders. So thanks for already putting your hand up.
Yeah, we'll be very interested. And I'm sure others on the call will be. So you will be PwC will be leading this initiative?
With Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. They are, of course, our clients.
Good. All right, great. Great. Questions? Any other questions before we wrap up, because we almost at noon. Okay. So Zia, you wanna wrap up? Tell us what words of wisdom do you want to leave us with, and then we'll ask Richard.
I'd say that we are obviously coming to, or have passed that critical point of needing to do things differently. And in addition to self-reflection on the being an active part of actions and solutions that we need to drive, it would be to invest in your own sustainability and your own resilience. Because as the polycrisis and all these challenges are posed to us as businesses or as leaders or as anyone within an organization, it's sometimes easy to just, it's a lot. But it's push past and be resilient in being an active part of the solution, small parts or big parts, but we're all doing this together. And that's maybe my last message.
Thank you. Together. Richard.
I like that point, Jay. I mean, I was thinking of the term focus collaboration. And the reason why I thought about that in the context of leadership is that I attended a global conference recently. And the reality is the rest of the world sees us, the Caribbean, as one. And, you know, we see some of the downside of that where we show up on all of these gray and black and different color listings, right? And I think the point I want to make is let us prove the rest of the world right, that we are one. And that focus, collaboration, and leadership needs to happen in order for us to have a voice, in order for us to have a say. I mean, Gillian's mentioned Mia Motley, and Mia Motley is one voice, but really, as a region, we need greater collaboration, leadership, and that focus to really live up to how the rest of the world sees us, for us to have a voice.
I think we have to use Mia Motley and leaders like that to raise the decibel level so that people understand how serious we are and how we can work together to mitigate what's coming down the track. But thank you all very much. I really enjoyed this session. I've made copious notes. And I hope you're going to stay with us because we have Battling the Polycrisis next.